Hey, what's up, y'all? Today we are going to talk about 12 ways to supersize your tomato harvest. We're going to focus in on only the factors that influence how many tomatoes you're getting off your plants and ignore absolutely everything else. I'm going to link to a ton of incredible resources in the description if you're interested in digging in deeper. And at the end, we're going to talk about 2 really popular suggestions where I think the science might not justify the hype. All right, let's get into it. Tip number 1 of the day is to rethink your early season pruning strategy. Now, you probably read that it is important to remove those early lower leaves to reduce the chance of disease transfer from the soil and to get rid of unproductive leaves. After all, they sure can get pretty gnarly.
The thing is though, when your plants are still small, those lower leaves are still very much positively and meaningfully contributing to the plant's energy production, and we need all the energy we can get for that first fruit set.
That's why we no longer prune off those lower leaves unless they're actually hitting the ground or they're really close to it until the plant has had a chance to put on some flowers, put on some fruit. It was actually incredible. Then we can get in there when we know that those lower leaves are no longer productive and get aggressive and get removing them. If you already know that you struggle with early season disease issues, well, yeah, you can probably stand to be a little bit more aggressive with that early pruning. But for many of us, disease pressure doesn't really come into play until later in the season. And all we're doing by removing those lower leaves really early on is making life harder on our baby plants. Now, another really good way to increase the overall size of your harvest throughout an entire growing season is to delay that first harvest. Our rule is to prune off any flower trusses until the plant is at least 18 inches high, typically about a month after transplant.
Kind of counterintuitive, but the basic premise here is that the plant's goal is just not the same as our goal. It will happily fruit very early in its life cycle, spending tons of energy early on to make seeds in the fruit and reproduce as soon as possible, when it's more optimal for us to force that energy into root and foliage growth.
Okay, next up we have phosphorus timing. So phosphorus is a really critical nutrient for things like disease resistance, root growth, and fruit development. Good stuff, right? The thing about phosphorus though is that it's primarily limited early in the season due to 2 factors. The first factor is that phosphorus is just less efficiently taken up when those soil temperatures are still on the cooler side. And then the second factor is the plant is just less able to get all the phosphorus it needs when its root system is still small.
It's pretty common to only introduce a high phosphorus fertilizer later in the season, relying on compost and manure to do the work in those early days. So the tip here is to change it up a bit. Work in a fertilizer with a high p-value, that's that middle number in the NPK ratio on the back of every fertilizer bag, right around the time of transplant.
Now that could look like using a strong synthetic fertilizer like this 16-16-16 stuff if you're using synthetic nutrients, or double checking that your organic fertilizer actually contains significant quantities of phosphorus. Now most tomato-specific plant foods do, but some are actually really surprisingly low on it, so it's just worth double checking. Your baby plants are gonna thank you.
These black cherry and super sweet 100s are not only super tasty, they have been our highest yielding tomatoes this season. Not by chance, but because we chose both of them, at least in part because they're very prolific varieties.
Now, on the flip side, sometimes you're just gonna have really delicious low yielding varieties, and it's up to you if that's worth it. This Paul Robeson is one of the best tomatoes I've ever tried, and it is also our single lowest yielding variety we're growing this season. Tomatoes are a very profitable crop, both for commercial growers as well as for sale to home gardeners, and that has resulted in just this unfathomable number of varieties that we get to choose from.
And we've learned really the hard way, there truly are differences in the yields you can expect depending on which variety you choose. Try to look out for keywords like high yield or productive on the seed packet description.
Another important element of this is selecting for varieties that have relevant disease resistances. Some modern hybrids have an incredible array of disease resistances to things like tobacco mosaic virus, fusarium wilt, root rot, and many more. Check out the website for Johnny's Seeds to get some really cool examples of this. If you can, check out what's on sale at your local farmer's market. Your local market gardeners are likely to have a good grasp on which varieties are going to be productive in your local climate. Tip number 5 is that all else held equal, indeterminate plants like this lovely white cherry right here are going to be more productive than a determinate plant. And that is going to be doubly true if you live in an area with either long growing seasons or only moderate disease pressure that's going to allow you to get the most out of those really long-lived plants.
Now, succession planting multiple crops of determinate tomato plants, one after another, that works well too, but it is just hard to get around the reality that the yield and potential of a plant that can grow into a monster like this by July, that's hard to beat.
We actually made the switch to 100% indeterminate tomatoes this year, and I'm honestly really glad we did. It's been a great decision.
Number 6 on our list can massively improve the size of your harvest for a one-time cost of $5 and basically no additional effort on your part. The concept is pretty simple. Our tomato flowers, they require nothing more than a simple shake on the flower to dislodge the pollen onto the female reproductive organ in order to pollinate. The problem is that pollinator insects generally don't find tomato flowers to be all that appealing. They're kind of small, they don't have a ton of pollen, and by relying on nothing more than wind and insects, we are truly leaving food on the table. So instead, get yourself an electric toothbrush to do the work for you.
Just carry one of these around, and as you are out in your garden, perusing your plants, give those little flower trusses a few seconds of vibration to just instantly supersize your whole harvest. It is incredible how well this works.
So I really like these cheap ones that just take like a AA or AAA battery. That way I don't have to worry about recharging it. I can just plop it in there next to my knee pads and my giant hat and all my cool gardener dad gear, and I can just be on my way and never have to worry about it. It's always there when I need it.
So for tip number 7, let's circle back to plant food. I talked a little bit about using a stronger balanced fertilizer at the point of transplant, but the flip side of that is that all of the potassium in these strong balanced fertilizers mostly goes to waste early in that plant's life cycle. But on the other hand, when your plant starts to set flowers and fruit, boy oh boy does it need a lot of potassium. Now the issue here is that if we continue using a strong balanced fertilizer with lots of nitrogen or any high nitrogen fertilizer, organic or otherwise, well, we're gonna end up with plants that are encouraged to set lots of leaves and not lots of fruit, which is the exact opposite of our goal here today.
So instead, it's important that we transition over to a low nitrogen fertilizer with plenty of potassium. That is the K in the NPK, or the third number in the fertilizer ratio.
Now, if you just prefer to skip concentrated fertilizers altogether, compost is going to be a little bit better than chicken manure, which is going to be a little bit better than steer manure. And I'm going to link to a really cool experiment that kind of rank ordered them in the description if you're interested. Tomatoes need lots of sun to put on lots of fruit. Groundbreaking stuff, I know. I actually did try to grow tomatoes in a windowsill once with just comically bad results. So, I feel like I'm qualified to talk about this.
But they can definitely get too much of a good thing when it comes to sunlight. If you're in an area where temperatures spike into the mid-90s or higher for multiple days at a time, you're gonna face blossom drop issues where the pollen and the reproductive organs in those flowers becomes non-viable in the heat.
In those sorts of climates, shade cloth can work absolute wonders. Even really large-scale growers are starting to employ it more and more where we are. So the other thing you can do is try and plan out your garden ahead of time to provide a few hours of shade in those hottest afternoon sun hours, either using something like a tree or a house or a shed or whatever you might have available, permaculture style.
Okay, tip number 9 is to plant a couple early maturing varieties of tomatoes. And this may not actually improve your measurable yield, but I think the feeling of eating delicious vine-ripened homegrown tomatoes just a couple of months after you put those seedlings into the ground is the same as getting more tomatoes later in the season. Maybe that's just me, I get it's a little bit fuzzy. Now, I like early maturing varieties of cherry tomatoes, like this white cherry. I think it's ready about 59 days after transplant, but if you like slicer tomatoes, there are a ton of great varieties like Early Girl or New Girl that have you covered.
In recent years, more and more, the word has kind of gotten out to home gardeners and homesteaders like us that we too can benefit from the aggressive pruning styles that you might see in a commercial operation. Pruning those cherry tomatoes for a double liter, pruning those bigger slicer tomatoes up a single liter. I mean, basically we remove all of the suckers or most of the suckers from our indeterminate tomato plants and just grow them straight up a line.
But I think what is sometimes missed in that conversation is all the pruning we're doing allows for a much denser spacing scheme than was traditionally recommended. If we remove the vast majority of lateral growth from our plants, then they don't need anywhere near 3 feet between plants in the same row.
18 inches between plants in the same row is totally doable. And if you don't suffer from a whole lot of humidity or airflow related fungal diseases, I think you can experiment with even denser. We keep just going denser and denser every year, and so far we're better off for it. I'm going to link to a really interesting write-up by the University of Ontario that kind of just shows the various experiments that have looked at the relationship between spacing and yield and how little of a relationship there seems to be.
What is there to say about drip irrigation? It is time consuming. It is easy to do wrong. It is expensive. And unfortunately, it is also super effective.
The truth is, pretty difficult to deeply, slowly, irregularly water tomato plants using a hose or a sprinkler system. It would just take hours and hours, or you're gonna end up with plants with a lot of disease issues and shallower roots. Whereas once you've got it all set up, well, that's pretty easy to achieve with an automated irrigation system.
More importantly though, if your native soil is salty, like ours is, drip irrigation is critical to keeping the medium around the plants or roots low in salinity. And high salinity is an important environmental stressor that can lead to things like blossom end rot, among other things.
Okay, we are at the end of the list, and that is fitting because we are talking about the end of the season. Every year as fall gets just a little bit closer and that first frost date starts inching towards us, we have to make those tough decisions about how we are going to capture that last and final harvest of the year. Now, picking those green tomatoes before they're fully ripe off the vine and bringing them inside to ripen indoors can be a really good strategy. But if you do it too early, they're never going to ripen and you're going to lose out on that last harvest. The trick is to learn how to identify the mature green stage and the breaker stage of those fruits.
Mature green refers to the point in which the fruit has reached its final size and has developed mature seeds within. The problem is, you can only really tell by cutting it open. So instead, we want to wait for the breaker stage, where the ethylene gas production begins to ripen and color the fruit, and we can see a pinkish tint on up to around 10% of the tomato, typically starting at that blossom side.
At this point, you can just bring your tomato inside and let it ripen in either a paper bag or a cardboard box. We just want something that has some gas exchange, a little bit of aeration. But there are two tips in the tomato growing world that are both super popular right now, but also seem to demonstrate mixed results under controlled circumstances. And the first is salicylic acid, aspirin, foliar sprays.
The idea goes that you're going to dissolve some aspirin, which contains salicylic acid, into water, and then spray it onto your plants to induce a stress response that aids with everything from fruit quality to fruit production to insect resistance to disease resistance, all those good things.
The second one is adding effective microorganisms or beneficial bacteria or beneficial fungi from bottles or bags directly into your soil to supplement what is living in there already or what that you hope to create in that living soil. Now, I am far from qualified to say conclusively whether salicylic acid sprays or effective microorganism supplementation are effective strategies for the home gardener, but my read is they haven't been proven to be slam dunks yet. Although in fairness, they are clearly interesting enough that researchers are spending time and money and effort to look into them, so I think they're worth keeping an eye on. But for me, since they're not slam dunks yet, I'm not gonna spend my time and my money on my effort on them yet, particularly that salicylic acid spray, because at the end of the day, that has the potential to do harm. Do you have anything that you would add to this list? I mean, these were our 12 favorites and they've been really effective for us, but I know that there are so many other techniques and strategies that would enhance our harvest next year, and I would absolutely love to hear your suggestions in the comments. And as always, y'all, happy gardening, and I hope to see you on the next one.